Hi, I'm John Cutterback.
And I'm Sofia Cutterback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
and raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship,
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live.
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. Welcome to the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast. Today's episode, Feeling Overwhelmed, Strategies for Attaining Peace. I'm John Cutterback. I'm happy to be here with my wife, Sofia, and with whom better to discuss the issue of being overwhelmed than my wife.
Are you trying to imply that I'm overwhelmed, dear? That's okay. I'll answer the question.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
I, with so many other moms and wives and mothers, do definitely feel overwhelmed at times.
Which is certainly okay, and you are not alone in that. And I at times certainly feel overwhelmed also. But I mean, obviously, anyone can feel overwhelmed. We're here in this podcast focusing on the household, and I'd say here in particular. Well, we're going to look at it through the eyes of parents, spouses, and though it certainly can have a ripple effect into a feeling overwhelmed in others in the household, and that's an important aspect of this. But I have to admit, my inclination is to start with what is so common in first of all, our experience in our home, in our experience of talking to so many people, that it's just kind of the overwhelmed wife and mother is a profoundly important reality that needs to be reckoned with, and we need to work together on.
Sounds like a good place to start.
So is that okay for us to start there? Although, again, surely husbands too are overwhelmed. But when I was thinking about that, I was wondering, I don't want this to sound wrong, but in our experience, the main times I think I've been overwhelmed is when I'm kind of overwhelmed by your being overwhelmed. And that certainly is not to point a finger. But I think it more has to do with something of the nature of marriage and family and household, that the burdens, the kind of fundamental primordial burdens of life, the ones that are more burdensome, say, than a lot to do at work, are those burdens of home, that especially fall heavily on a woman who's really serious about being kind of at the heart of the home. And do you think that that's a reasonable reason or part of the picture as to why women especially can tend to be overwhelmed?
Yeah, I think that's because so many of the practical details, especially of a young home, a home with young children, really falls to the daily work of the mother, and it can really be overwhelming.
Although even more than just practical details, isn't it also just the way we've had this conversation before of how woman is in many ways a kind of emotional center.
Oh yeah, of course.
And
I mean,
think,
it's all of that put together. Yeah. Sure, yeah.
So I don't think it's unique to us the way, again, I things, you feel things, you suffer things in a kind of constant presence at the heart of the home way that's unique. And so when I experience your being overwhelmed, particularly because I want to be involved, and I want to understand what's going on, I want to be there with you, but it can be then especially and uniquely overwhelming for me precisely to see that happening in you. So I think to look at this, the idea here is hopefully to give strategies, again, first of all, that's going to focus on spouses and parents. I think they can be applied by extension to others in other situations. But why don't we begin here? I think a kind of analysis, just before we give the kind of strategies for how to approach it, to think a little bit about the diagnosis of what it's the experience of being overwhelmed. There's a couple different ways I think that this can unfold. As I was thinking about it, an image came to my mind of a rough sea. There's big waves, big waves I take as being there's a lot going on in life, a lot of demands. Whatever those demands are that can overwhelm us, that's kind of the rough seas. Sometimes we're able to just kind of float up with those waves, and they're not so much going over our head, they're big waves. But you know how people that are particularly good swimmers slash very buoyant, they go up and they come down, they go up and they come down. They can actually be having a great time in that very rough sea. Whereas at the same time, in that same rough sea, you could have people that they're staying afloat. They haven't sunk, but it's like as the wave goes up, they often kind of duck under, and they're kind of gasping for breath. They're spluttering. That's what I'm picturing as overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
As we're not talking about someone who's simply been crushed or given up, but we're talking about someone in a rough sea, and you experience the waves as not just high, but too high.
Mm-hmm.
They're going over you, and you're gasping for breath. And it's kind of this root experience of kind of like, oh my gosh, how long can I go on like this? You know how there's something very deep about and terrorizing about not being able to breathe. Isn't it kind of like? I mean, does that sound like? I mean, again,
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And I think pretty much everybody listening to who's experienced overwhelmed can identify with that person who's the waves are kind of crashing over them. They're still paddling. I'm sure you actually probably raised several people's heart rate as they were listening to that. It's a great analogy. I'd like to just add to the analogy. I mean, normally, it kind of kills the analogy sometimes when you give too much explanation of it, but to just apply the analogy to daily life. Like what are the things that you said? You keep saying the word rough seas. What are the things that make rough seas in a domestic environment that a woman could experience as the waves are getting too high and they're getting too close together? So just I think it might be helpful to illustrate a little bit on a practical level how we experience that. I'm thinking,
can you do
yeah,
that?
sure. I'm thinking things like, for example, young children who aren't sleeping at night. So there's certain things that we're very accustomed to having happen regularly and without much thought. All of a sudden, having children who don't sleep at night, or multiple children who are sick and not sleeping at night, you're not getting rest. They continue to demand things from you during the day, but you're not getting nighttime rest. Or a child who has a medical need or is sick, let's just say even a bad cough or a cold. Then on top of their care is added the anxiety of how am I to interpret this? Is this a serious problem? Is it a little problem? And then while that's going on, you're still having to warm some hot dogs for lunch and clean up the dishes and, all the other myriad of things, practical details that don't go away because someone's sick or you have to think extra hard to solve a problem. So, those would be small things that are a description. And then, maybe like having to make a regular grocery list or having to stop everything and make dinner while someone needs something different. So those are the kind of things that one day like that, I have to chuckle. If I would go away for a day and I'd come back and you'd have the house perfectly clean and dinner was on the table and the kids were all happy and pretty much all put together, I think to myself, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. I feel like such a loser mom because I'm always at the end of my wits at the end of the day. And I think it makes a huge difference to have not just one day like that. You can keep your head above the waves when the first one hits.
Sure.
It's when you have repeated waves that are all identical. We're not talking about like huge white caps, breaking on. We're not talking about a horrible storm. We're just talking about that consistent up, 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 up that happens day after day after day. And that's what begins to make the swimmer begin to dip under the wave and feel overwhelmed.
Sure. And it's funny. And even in your saying that brings back memories. And I feel bad. And it just really struck me here that, okay, so, I felt really good about myself. I said, okay, Sofia, wow, clearly you're kind of strung out. We better get you a little day off here.
Mm-hmm.
So you go take that day off. I've got the kids today. And I could feel great that, it's just, I could put all my energy into let's make this fun for them. And, probably wasn't doing a whole lot of schooling, probably not worrying about a whole lot of chores.
It's generally a Saturday.
Just kind of,
I think you would get several loads of laundry done in that time.
Maybe, but fundamentally, the thing that really strikes me there is I knew at the end of the day, first of all, I'd get big brownie points. And it's like, wow, I really did the good deed. And then frankly, I get to go back to things
Something
that are
different.
not as overwhelming.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
that's the thing, right? So it is terrible to think how I probably did this to some extent. You spend that day and you think, uh, well, that wasn't that bad. Kind of, what's the big
Hmm.
deal here? Of course, it would take. I mean, that would be pretty thick-headed to not recognize that. Maybe sometimes also, by the way, the experience was, and men have this experience also. They kind of take over for a day at home and realize, wow, this really is hard, right?
Hmm.
Much harder than one might have. Not that anyone ever doubted that it was difficult, but I mean to really taste it in that way. But in case that's the relentless character
Hmm.
of those, can we, and those oh so important, and isn't it funny, the things that especially a woman kind of specializes in, and or even if it's things that she doesn't specialize in, that very often that are relegated to her by the demands, if it is a situation where primarily the man is going out and has a profession out there, there's a number of things that are just going to be relegated to the wife, where they're absolutely necessary. I mean, they're just their root. They have to get done. If they don't get done, there's really going to be a problem. It's going to be a big mess. So it's going to be unhealthy. People are going to be
Hmm.
hungry. Whatever it is, they're not so flashy. They're not so fulfilling, but they're relentlessly demanding,
Hmm.
and that's a tough combination.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. Oh, we should stop talking about the practical
Yeah,
details because
that
I feel my blood pressure
Yeah, I'm
rising.
too. I'm just
Let's
getting
get to some
just getting worn
strategies.
out. So,
Oh,
is there
gee.
something we can do about this, or was it
Yes.
just okay? So, if we bear in mind those waves, I think the first thing to say about a strategy towards addressing this is, maybe we need to do something to bring those waves down.
Hmm.
And I think that's where, in our discussion today, I don't want to focus on that so much, but I think we absolutely need to begin with, um, are the waves too high?
Hmm.
Is this just too much to reckon with? And let's look at this from the viewpoint of spouses. Here's a great starting point to have that conversation. I mean, clearly a key strategy here. I'm going to say it now. I'm going to keep coming back to this. It might sound like a little bit of an old sawhorse, but I really think we need to take a new look at this. The principle of, let's give hope right now. If nothing else, working through this together is one of the main ways we're going to work out our marriage.
Hmm.
That
So
we're
the
going to
way,
deepen our
yeah,
relationship.
being together.
I mean, that
Yeah.
that much is it's a key principle of the household, and we're not and we're gonna give some more concrete strategies here. But I think this is maybe it's a 50,000 feet, but you need the 50,000 foot view here. If for starters, this has to be an opportunity for better communication, deeper relationship. I'd almost go so far as to say, I've kind of asserted this kind of thing before, that this is so difficult is in a sense part of the plan. We have to go through this together, that it's so common. Clearly it's something that is just, in some sense, a normal part. Now, I will at the same time sidebar, I think we live in a society that makes it even more stressful than it would have been naturally.
Mm.
Be that as it may, it always would have been something that would have to be worked through. And on that score, I'd say by a natural design, it's in kind of figuring this out and not being overwhelmed by the greatness and the many demands that this vocation absolutely demands of us.
Mm.
That's where, in a particular way, we have the opportunity, if we're willing, to deepen our relationship. So,
Hmm.
for starters, we're going to have a conversation that looks like, um, do we need to do something to let some of the water out of the tank,
Hmm.
to get some of those waves down? What do you
Hmm.
think?
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. And I just want to say what that conversation looks like a little bit is, I think you asked the question of what's at the heart of what our household is demanding of us right now. So, and I think this is a conversation that needs to be had periodically, not just like through big moments of change in your family, because your family is constantly changing, your household is changing. So you need to revisit that question, because of course the need of the household changes as the demographics of the household change. But maybe it even needs to happen more frequently, because it helps us to keep our focus as spouses on what is it that we're trying to do together, because the practical details can become overwhelming in themselves. And I think it really helps to just remember, well, what is the main goal that we're working out? What is the goal right now for the flourishing of the members of this household? And then we want to be having, and then by talking about that, that gives us the kind of ruler, or the kind of yardstick by which to measure, are these things that we're doing, how necessary are they? How close to the heart of what we need to be doing for our family? And that begins to be a way that we begin to say, well, this can be let go, or we shouldn't be doing this. Or so if you're trying, I think that's important to talk about. Sometimes the waves just need to be brought down before anything else is discussed, because sometimes that's true. And I would say, especially part of the reason in the modern world that's really hard is so much is available to us.
Right.
And I think that we end up putting tons of things in our plate, and our plate gets more and more full and we don't even realize it. And so that's why that conversation needs to be happening periodically, where you just start thinning, things out that have gotten onto the family schedule, or things that you do or don't do, or the way you do things needs to be periodically reassessed in light of what is the goal of what we're trying to do for our household. And then thinning has to happen, because no matter how much you change, attitude or tools or techniques, if the waves are too big, they're just too big. Right. And so I think that is a very important first principle right there.
And I like how you cast it in a way that is always kind of a starting point, reminding ourselves of hierarchy, of priority. Mm-hmm. What's most important? What is our life together in the household most about? And I think that takes us back to why very often it is the woman that gets more overwhelmed, because it is a little bit closer to the things that are absolutely primordial. Mm-hmm. And she then will very often, especially if you've been blessed with more than one child, will have a sense of, we're not talking about things here that can particularly be thinning out, mm-hmm. right? And so that's where I think our main focus should be on here in our discussion of if we can't particularly bring down the waves, how can we try to float over rather than getting drowned by it?
Absolutely.
But I mean, you've been taking a program that has a lot of strategic things, including kind of thinking about thinning. Can you just mention that? Who was that again?
So it's the Optimal Work Program by Kevin Majors, and it's been super helpful. A lot of really helpful psychological techniques and ways of approaching your work that help you maintain an equilibrium while you're doing those works. It's really, it's fabulous.
So that's going to help on floating up and over also. But he also talks about, doesn't he, scaling back also?
It's part of it is he doesn't really talk so much about scaling back, but more just that when there are tasks that you need to do, how it is that we're approaching them so that they become something we can manage. Good. So I think that's important. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we're talking about bringing waves down. It should never be our goal that there are no waves, because that would be completely unrealistic. That's not really a human experience, whether you're married and part of a household, or unmarried, or in college, or in grade school. The reality is life is waves. So, so the goal is not to take down waves. It's about how you said buoyancy in the beginning when you made that description. Some people are more buoyant than others, but people who aren't naturally buoyant can probably increase their buoyancy. And so I think that's, we're definitely, we do what we can to reduce the waves. And then we also ask the question about, are there ways that we can become more buoyant? I do also just want to mention that we had said, we just kind of, it's so easy to say, you need to have a discussion to assess, what's the hierarchy of needs in the household. I just want to acknowledge that is actually a complicated conversation. And its complexity is part of, as you said, the gift. But it's a conversation that involves things that, what desires are near and dear to the heart of each of the spouses. Right. What are the individual needs of the children? So we're not just talking about, should we be playing 3 sports with this child, or do we play any sport? Those are important questions, but there are kind of more nuanced questions that go into that conversation. Lest we make it sound too easy, that it actually is a conversation that really requires an ongoing effort and commitment on the part of the spouses, which is beautiful that it demands that, because it means that two of them are looking at one another.
Yeah.
And that's where you really experience that togetherness.
Mm-hmm.
So the demand of the conversation is something that finds us in a place that actually is very easy to avoid in a busy, especially overwhelmed marital relationship, where we often become too busy to have that mutual gaze. So anyway, I just wanted to acknowledge
Right.
that that
Right.
conversation can be quite nuanced and complicated at times.
Indeed. And it's going to take a lot of effort and prayer. Well, I have come up, dear, with kind of three specific suggestions. I'm interested to see what you think. It's kind of distilling of some things that we've talked about and some things that we've tried, and so I'm going to toss them out there, and then I want to get your feedback. I'll quickly list them. Again, I'm particularly looking at this from the viewpoint of a wife, the overwhelmed wife, but I think it can go both ways. I'm going to say the first one is seek help from your spouse. The second one is seek understanding / compassion from your spouse. And the third one is seek a new understanding in your own mind. So let's just I'll explain each of them in turn. But I mean, the first one's pretty straightforward. We just talked about having a conversation between spouses about, do we need to do something to bring down the waves? Assuming that we have that conversation, as you just noted, there's going to be big waves. Life is going to be very challenging. And this is one of the things I hear most often. People say, well, I don't see anything I really can cut out. So, I'm feeling overwhelmed. What do I do? So kind of looking in that direction, I do think that often we still need to, this isn't the same thing as bringing down the waves. This is just working together in the things that need to get done. I'm thinking especially a wife going to her husband and saying, somehow it just has to happen that I have more direct help from you in X, Y, and Z. And I think it shouldn't be underestimated the extent to which, I mean, you tell me if you think otherwise, dear, but I think too many wives are maybe in a kind of courage, in a kind of generosity. They would feel guilty about asking that of their oh so busy husband who's already doing so much, and so they kind of isolate themselves and just force themselves to keep handling it alone. These kind of primordial home things. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason that we run into that problem is because so many of the things that fall to a woman's task have a connotation of it's a woman's work. And so already I think a lot of men are set up to, one, feel not competent to do these things, or two, that it's somehow beneath their dignity, or I'm doing my part, you're doing yours. And so that's why I think there's a difficulty sometimes wives asking for their husbands to help in this regard, but also sometimes for the request being heard well.
Right.
It's very hard for a man to receive that. And, let's face it, I think that having children in a household simply makes a practical demand on both the couple, both people in the couple, both the woman and the man, that is something far beyond anything that you could have comprehended when you decided to get married and say yes. Even if you were thinking about having kids, it's like, does anyone really understand the demands that are involved there before they have to experience them? I mean, you were part of a family. I was part of a large family, but I was never in charge of that family. So it was a completely different experience for me when I got married and started having kids. And so I think there's a challenge where in some ways, both the man and the woman would feel a little bit inclined to step away from that. Like, oh, that's too much for me. It's too hard. It's too demanding. The reality is the mother, first of all, because young children have an actual need for her body, her physical presence in a way that's simply integral to the survival of the child, the mother's not really free to go away. Whereas the dad is. So sometimes I think it's just, and this isn't making a monster of men, but like both the man and the woman have almost a protective instinct to say, I can't do that. That's too much. A woman crosses that barrier much sooner because of the demands put on her physically in the household. It's kind of natural that a man would go, oh, that's a little bit too much for me. Or standing from the outside looking at it, you're doing a great job. Go for it. Good, rah, rah. Go, you keep doing that. I can't really do that. So there's almost a protective instinct of that's more than I can handle. I can't do that too. And it's really, I think, for both the man and the woman, it is an invitation to jump in with both feet. And in a certain sense, the joys and delights that are offered, and maybe this kind of maybe the source of buoyancy actually comes from actually just embracing the requirements of the daily tasks as being, this is what our life together consists in. It's not this niggling peripheral thing that's like a gnat flying around your head. This is actually it. This is where the rubber hits the road. And so for women who might feel a little bit shy or feel bad about inviting their husband or about asking him for that help, it's actually doing him a tremendous gift to say, not like, oh, I'd like to have you. No, I need you. Then it creates a moment where he has to come in. He has to step in. He actually has to participate in this activity that is the household and have an intimate experience of this is our life together. It's when your hands get dirty that you actually realize what it's like.
And you're saying it's going to be a gift to him. And I let's give a couple quick examples. Let's put these on the airwaves. There's so many examples that could be given. That a wife says, just very concretely, I need you to take care of the dishes. I need you to take care of all the dishes. Period. Mm-hmm. Just something like this. I to pull that back of, well, okay, or at least in these particular, these particular times, these particular areas. How about, look, little children, when they get a boo-boo, there is something special about going to mama. Okay, granted. But there's a lot of things that the children might by default start to go to their mother. Is it in part because their father hasn't cultivated in himself what he needs to cultivate, namely a kind of openness and warmth to receive the child? Sure. And it's honestly a little too convenient for the father to not cultivate that, because then the children just keep going to the mother. And that's just another thing that's could be exactly what pushes that wave too high. Mm-hmm. And so for a wife may even sometimes to say, dear, I'm going to ask you to be very careful in your ever saying, go to your mother about that. Mm-hmm. When the children come to you, or even, dear, I need you, when you see the children coming to me, when you are here, I need you to reach out to them. Don't get upset at them. You need to be winning and inviting and show them how you want them to come to you about whatever different kinds of things. Yeah. Let me throw out another example that a wife just might say something like, okay, we've gotten to the point with our teenage daughters where there's going to have to be, some discussions here about modesty and dress, and very often a man is just not going to, the father's not really tuned in, and lo and behold, the mother's handling that. Well, I happen to think that that's something that's particularly important that the husband do, and so all more so than in maybe other things where it wasn't something that especially the man should take care of, but just needed his help. Mm-hmm. Here's something the man should take care of, but the practices of our day have not pointed that out, helped him understand something like that is a particularly masculine way of engaging with the children. Yeah. And so many of these things by default end up, I think, becoming a mother's burden. And of course, it's great for men to take the initiative and recognize that themselves. If they're not, that's part of this. Go to your husband for help, and be clear and confident and straightforward in making those needs known of a whole set of different kinds of things.
Yeah, we're talking about the topic here is overwhelmed, and certainly when a husband is involved in that way, it does help the overwhelmed issue. But it's just as you're describing those things, it struck me, wow, that's fixing overwhelm. But actually, look how beautiful it is that in a really healthy home environment, how many things are achieved at the same time. So on the one hand, you're relieving the burden, taking down the waves off of your wife. But really what you're doing from a very young child, you're developing a relationship where the child feels comfortable coming to you. Because if you're trying to help the mother by not being overwhelmed, by making sure that the children come to you sometimes too, you're working really hard to develop an attitude that welcomes them. And boy, let me tell you, that's really what you want to have when your children become teenagers and are experiencing all kinds of difficulties through engagement with the bigger world. You want them to come to daddy,
Yeah,
not just to
for
mommy,
sure.
but especially teenagers need their dad. So, and that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because that's teenagers need their dad. And all of a sudden their dad, who really hasn't been present, is now going to be interesting and inviting to them. Not really. And so it's a beautiful thing that while the goal was to bring the waves down for the mom, it's actually creating an environment of relationship. Or another thing that, for example, doing dishes. It provides an example to the children in the family. And hopefully, ideally, as the children get older, they participate in some of the physical tasks that they're able to, and that brings down the waves. But in the case of dad doing dishes, the children are learning by seeing that this is how daddy cares for mommy. He's helping her. It prepares them for works of charity, how to help others in physical needs, even if the way that you need to help someone is not something that you would normally do or doesn't really fit a kind of stereotype. There's no concern about jumping in and doing it because they saw daddy doing all kinds of things that aren't typical dad things because he had compassion on mommy and is helping bring down the waves, so to speak. So I just think it's beautiful how a lot of those practical things that you mentioned actually have many layers to it that actually help in the kind of flourishing of all the members of the household.
Or in this case, great point. And going back to our analogy with the waves, he's not necessarily, he's bringing down the amount of the wave that is just his wife's. So, I mean, the total amount of work hasn't, in this case, been brought down, but it's like they're in there joining their buoyancy together.
His buoyancy is helping hers.
And they're working together. I mean, and this is, we've had other conversations at this podcast about the importance of working together as one of the key forms of shared life, right? A very Wendell Berry point. Well, this is like you said, the multivalence here of there's going to be a lot of fruits of in this case, from the angle that we're talking about here, where it is the common one of the overwhelmed wife of in inviting strongly the husband to in concrete ways into these areas. And again, I say both ones that are maybe where otherwise, if the husband's normally gone, that the wife's going to have to be doing it a bit by herself. But there's nothing about laundry that's intrinsically feminine. I mean, well, so men need to, the extent possible, right?
Yeah.
But there are these other things that are even intrinsically masculine that we need to rediscover, and we can't go into it. But I've given one example of that. We could give others. But I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that this seems like it's a perfect segue to your next point. At least I'll share from my personal perspective that having you do dishes or something that's menial, that makes a big difference in my burden. It isn't particularly your responsibility to go in it like per se. It actually makes me feel like you understand something of my experience, that you saw and had compassion and therefore did the dishes. And so I think your next point was
which way we need to go
is seeking empathy from the other. And of course this goes both ways. But in this case, very practically, we're talking about a woman's overwhelm, that when a man responds to a woman's call for help, of course she has to call. If she doesn't call, it's great if he sees it on his own, but we're all human. It's beautiful to ask for help. But when the call is responded to, then it begins to have this experience of he sees me. So, and that's the thing you mentioned. Very often a woman has to do those tasks when the man's not home anyway, but that gives her buoyancy to do those tasks, knowing that he understands from wherever he is that it is difficult for her to carry that.
I'm absolutely convinced. Look, this might just sound like, oh yeah, of course, but no, we really have to focus on this. We need to turn this around before our eyes. This is extremely important. We need to look at it again and again and again, because while we've all heard this, it's honored in the breach. I just think it's so seldom done. Here I think I accuse myself as a man. That there's the proverbial thing of men try to solve the problem rather than empathize. It's not about the nail. I mean, there's this is proverbial because right here is where it's so naturally difficult. It's kind of the epicenter of a man being willing and able to really go in and just be with her.
Mm-hmm.
It's now. There's an aspect of a woman has to let him in. She does, and maybe to the kind of jaded, angry, overburdened. I can imagine that can be a challenge, and I'll ask you that in a second. I mean, or maybe particularly if he hasn't been coming and been there, it might be hard to let him in. But just from the man's side here, I know it's very difficult. I've been trying and trying and trying, and I keep realizing how it takes me getting out of a zone. I am convinced by a natural plan this was a significant, if not the central way that a man needs to grow in marriage. That he needs to be, despite all the burdens and struggles that I have and all the things that I have to do, that I have to do this uniquely difficult thing of opening my heart to just go in and suffer with you in your burden. And I think the big psychological mistake I can make is, but wait, there's a distinction of work. I mean, traditional household, woman does this over here, man does this over here. There is a kind of division of labor, but not a separation. It's one thing to have, or there's more a difference, but not a division. And I need to take it up with you, kind of in heart. This takes a willing on my part, opening myself emotionally. This is why I have to be willing to just listen and try to enter it and be there with you. Then you're not alone. Isn't a huge part of being overwhelmed and spluttering and gasping for air when you feel like you're alone.
Mm-hmm.
Or in any case, it's not that you're completely alone, but you're not really understood.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is so proverbial, but let's focus in. The person, in this case, the woman that we're talking about, she needs to recognize that. She shouldn't feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
She should not feel that way. You and I have a favorite shared line from a psychologist we love who said, you can't avoid suffering, but you can avoid suffering alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this is about. No wife should ever feel alone,
Mm-hmm.
feel not understood. And a man is going to have to do something about that.
Mm-hmm. I do want to acknowledge that I think it's just so beautiful how you put that marriage is this unique invitation for a man to grow, particularly in that kind of way. But I want to also acknowledge that the reason this is hard, it's not just because men are bad or of bad will. It's actually difficult because men and women are different. And especially in that particular area of empathy and openness of the heart and being present with, that's not really what's directly in the purview of a man's kind of ambit. And so this is why it's particularly challenging for him, and why to actually respond to the challenge is particularly fruitful. It gives him this incredibly rich additional aspect to himself. But I just want to acknowledge that I do think that this is very challenging and difficult for men. And you're talking about a woman should never feel alone. I mean, in some ways, I think this is precisely where a man begins to feel overwhelmed and even possibly alone, because he's designed differently. And that doesn't mean that he's not required to step over into something that's different from, he is, in fact, and this is what's going to produce the fruit in him. But I think it's good to acknowledge that this isn't second nature for him. The household, and especially the care of the young, which is the beginning, the earlier times, aren't the things that are most immediately intuitive to him. And so it really takes a real kind of effort on his part. And I think it's very helpful for a woman to understand that. First of all, it makes her invitation be super important, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I think we women can often feel offended that a man doesn't automatically see this. Like, I mean, what could be more obvious that I really need a hand here?
Mm-hmm.
But I think, it's not because they're being thick, they're designed differently. And so our invitation needs to be kind of aware of that when we invite them in, always being confident that that invitation is an invitation to richness for them, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's also important for women to keep in mind that difference, because it's a way of acknowledging that this is something that's difficult for them. You're still going to ask it for them, and they do need to come, but it's difficult for them. And so we have kind of a compassion or understanding in that regard. And in that sense, I think a man doesn't feel alone when his wife understands that she's asking something from him that's
huge.
going to be
That's
very
absolutely
difficult.
huge, dear.
Yeah.
That is very, very striking to me, because we already said this. You already said this, that a woman has to have confidence when she's asking for help, that she's actually asking for something that the man needs.
Mm-hmm.
This is very dramatic, that a man also might not experience himself as being alone. Men tend to be a little bit more loners, I think,
Mm-hmm.
in any case, but maybe we just don't realize that what we're made for is this opening our heart and going in and being with our wife. It is that is going to be a kind of a resolution of a loneliness maybe that we don't so much recognize that we have.
Sure.
And what exacerbates the loneliness, when you have what I think is all too common, and we've certainly experienced it ourselves, of where there starts to be that kind of wall of hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Then and that's where you're saying it part of it is the man is feeling like she just doesn't get it. I mean, I'm kind of trying, but this isn't natural to me. So what's the big deal here? What am I doing
Mm-hmm.
wrong? So he feels misunderstood. He feels that she's just getting angry. So the classic, each feels misunderstood,
Mm-hmm.
therefore each feels alone. So talk about then being overwhelmed on both sides. I think that's probably when then I most felt overwhelmed, kind of knowing that you're feeling overwhelmed, feeling like I don't know what to do about that, maybe even feeling like you don't really have confidence that I can do something
Mm-hmm.
about it. So it would go back to how a woman does bring that to her husband. I'm not bringing all the burden so she has to start. I mean, it would be very important here, may men joining this conversation with us take the opportunity to take the lead themselves,
Mm-hmm.
to start this conversation themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ideally, that's, kind of man as initiator should be able to recognize, I need to be going to my wife. She's overwhelmed. I need to take the lead here and
Mm-hmm.
go in there and say, what's missing? Dear, what do you need from me? That ideally should be happening. But if that's not, we're here also to be encouraging, empowering a woman to recognize there's nothing unfitting about you asking and
Mm-hmm.
calling out.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the stereotype of a woman's work has actually barred a man from feeling like, one, he ought, but two, that he can see, notice, and participate in. So, I mean, I think the stereotypes are very unhelpful in so many ways, but this is not a way that we normally think of a stereotype being harmful to the man. But in fact, it's kind of closed a door.
Good point.
For his entry, from his experience, his psychological perspective, that, oh, I don't go there. I'm not supposed to go there. It's kind of closed a door. And so maybe I'm hoping that maybe our listeners, the men listening here, realize, no, this world on the other side of the door is actually open for you. It's where you dwell. The household is for you to live there too, and you get to live in it as a participating, active member, so that you're not barred.
With your wife,
Yes.
making your life together.
Yeah.
there, which connects to so many other wonderful themes about actually then how can we try to broaden and enrich the kind of work that's going on there to give us more work to share together in the home. These are not easy things, but that's part of it. Let's go to the third, which it is very closely connected to these, but the way that I put it was kind of seek a deeper understanding in ourselves about the work that we're doing. And here, I mean, again, this is a large field, but this is the proverbial thing we've heard often, but it demands our coming back to it. How can we change our attitude? How can we change our understanding? How can we change how we think about what's going on here with all of this work that I have to do? So how can we try to go from that person that's being overwhelmed to raising our buoyancy? Well, a bit of it is going to be just how we think about what is going on.
Yeah. I love that way of putting it versus the word changing our attitude.
Okay.
Because, I mean, not that using the word attitude is wrong, but I love that you said it's, how can we understand differently what it is that we do? And that's really important because it's not just positive talk. Oh, well, if you just say, oh, this is really fun changing poopy diapers, it will be. I mean, although ironically, even that makes a difference. But I think you're talking about something deeper. I'd like to draw you out a little bit on that. What do you mean by different understanding? Like what kind of understanding, what would we change from and what are we changing to that gives us that additional buoyancy to be able to weather the waves?
Well, there's a lot there. And ultimately, I'm going to go spiritual here because we're going to put in a spiritual context. But before doing that explicitly, I would just say this is something we talk about a lot here, a richer understanding of household and just how rich, noble, and important this thing that we're doing together in making a home together. This is even if it's just a husband and wife who aren't blessed at this point with children,
or whose children are gone,
or children are gone.
Yeah.
What we're making together in this home is a good life. It's this is St. Thomas Aquinas has this philosophical way of putting it that what we do in the home is not about just some little part of life. What we do in the home is about life. It's about flourishing as whole human beings. Not that the household is sufficient unto itself, but what we're doing in the household is really about crafting our whole persons. And so to bring this new vision of maybe this isn't what I thought I signed up for in getting married. This isn't what I had been foreseeing. But to be able to run a mental drill now and say, first of all, given the choices I have made and where I am now, and a part of that might just be looking at a child or children, or even just that I'm married, living in this home together, given the choices I've made, the promises I've made, I'm being inexorably drawn back to very fundamental things. And are we being called to look differently and understand that particularly if we are prioritizing and we're trying to put the first things first, but those first things they demand a lot of us, and we're recognizing, hey, it might be the case again, we can't really bring these waves down, but we just say we might come to that realization of, well, this is life. This is where our marriage happens. This is where John Cutterback, say your name, where I am going to be who I'm going to be. What maybe I've had false conceptions about what I will do in life, and I need to. I mean, you kind of put this earlier, rather than maybe kind of living on the periphery, almost wondering, when does this stop? When do I get to do something else? But no, just embracing it and saying, this is the gift of my life. I embrace it and I receive it as a gift in its nobility. And we can help one another think better about our society is making us think, often these root things that we're doing are not so fulfilling. They're not so flashy. They're not the things that you post about. They're not the things that are going to make you
Mm-hmm.
famous. But when we see them for what they are, they become more fulfilling. They become more satisfying. What do you think?
Yeah, I love that. I think it's great. I mean, it is really jumping in with both feet, right? And it's worth jumping in. It's not like, whoa, this is terrifying. It's not like jumping off a bungee, like doing a bungee jump. It's like, wow, we want to go in there because this is life and life is good. But I would draw that out and say, I think this is why the household is the perfect and most complete place where we experience this, because it's about life for others. And I think that's what transforms
Yeah,
the
that's a
myriad of
great point.
things that tend to wash over us and overwhelm us and choke us, is in itself doing the dishes, scrubbing the floors, mowing the lawn. Those are things that simply become overwhelming, especially because of their frequency. But if we begin to see each thing as the reason it's part of this life is it is for the sake of the others in this household. And if every member in the household learns that, then it's not just our life, but our life becomes an extraordinary richness.
Amen.
It's about living for the other. Every task is something that you do for the sake of the other. And if we can do that, I think that's a great remedy for against bitterness in the household and in the
Surely.
relationship.
Surely, and this is not to superimpose. Here, look at it through this rose glass. Let's kind of pretend
Yeah.
that it's
No, no,
this.
no. It
This is the
actually
point.
is.
It's to finally see.
Yeah.
When we actually see, and this is where I come back so often in my mind to mothers, like you. This is life. This is, and I'm not going to come in and say, so this shouldn't be so hard for you. It shouldn't be overwhelming because this is actually much more fulfilling than you realize in some kind of patronizing way.
Mm.
But there is a truth to this thing that we must be making together. And part of the way that I show that I value it is that I'm seeking to embrace it with you.
Mm-hmm.
That this is forging our relationship, forming our children, making our home a home of hospitality. This is life. This is where we're putting our energies. This is what I'm in many ways made for. This is where I'm going to become the kind of person that I was designed to be. And so again, this is to see it for what it is. And this isn't some little mental trick. I mean, that when we're going about our way doing these things, to the extent that we see these in light of the end that they serve, in light of the end in which in some way they participate already, that this is absolutely going to make us more buoyant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that that's the moment I'd like to just then go explicitly, spiritual, Christian, center it on Christ here for a moment. Just like we said, it really strikes me, just like we said, that there's a natural plan of where you have to work this out. It's a matter of relationship. I dare say we might look at it through this angle. What if a wife right now said, I don't have a husband that I can come to in that way, or I have come and he doesn't listen. We have a bad relationship. So how everything that you're saying doesn't apply? Then you know what I say? There's a deeper relationship. That's the most important relationship. We bring those burdens to the Lord. In a sense, all those approach in a kind of feminine way. Lord, you're kind of like on the model of the conversation we were saying earlier. I need your help. I'm feeling alone here. Help me understand actually that you are in this with me. Help me understand that you are helping me. The good news is he's waiting for that invitation. He wants to come more in. In a sense, he already is more in. We're not alone. We need to open our eyes, our hearts to see that. So feeling overwhelmed can be the exact perfect invitation, not only to deepening a spousal relationship or a relationship between friends, a relationship between us and the Lord, of going to him and saying, I need your help. I need your understanding. Help me see this differently. And I think that connects back to the whole thing of then we'll see once again through those eyes, this is what the Lord's calling me to. This is how I'm going to work out my salvation and grow in the one relationship that most of all matters. The Lord is at the heart of the home. This wonderful natural design isn't just for us in the home. It's precisely that we flourish in the Lord. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that also strikes me when you say that. Again, these things are so multi-layered. You do it for one reason and it redounds to on so many other levels. That when we live a relationship of helping one another in love and self-sacrifice for the other in their overwhelmedness. I mean, imagine it becomes kind of the seedbed in which children learn that when I go to the Lord and ask him because I'm overwhelmed, I'm answered. The Lord comes to me and he helps. You know, when a wife asks her husband, I'm drowning, help me, his coming to her aid and living with her in their household becomes a pattern for the children that the Lord, who is our spouse, comes when we call. And that's a really beautiful thing.
Feeling overwhelmed is always an invitation to a deeper relationship with someone. And first of all, if possible, with our spouse, with a good friend, with whatever human person can be there with us in this. Feeling overwhelmed helps us, maybe first really prompts us to look outside ourselves and recognize that we're made for relationship. And isn't it incredible consolation to know that in God's great providence, there probably will be a human person, God granted to be our spouse, a good friend, but if nothing else, the Lord is always there for us. So that doesn't make being overwhelmed go away, but at least perhaps it can give us a little bit of a different perspective of even there being a kind of gift and a prompt to, well, grow a little bit more into the plant that we're designed to be.
Amen.
Thanks for having this conversation, baby. Great to be with you all. See you next time. Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.